Japan, land of the rising sun, center of an ancient culture and home to a people who until very recently used to breathe airs of heroism and patriotism imbued with the samurai spirit, is a people who have experienced profound transformations throughout the 20th century. Despite these changes, today's Japan continues under the influence of the legacy of Emperor Hirohito, the emperor with the longest reign in the history of Japan and one of the longest on Earth. Of the Axis powers in the World War, much has been said about Mussolini and the Führer, but not so much about the other Asian leader of this alliance, icon of Japanese nationalism and emperor during the years when Japan carried out its expansionist race. Hirohito led as monarch the Japanese in the Second World War, but also during the twilight of the Empire of Japan. When Hirohito assumed his reign in December of 1926, Japan was a powerful nation that was shaping up as a world power comparable to those of the West. And when he died in 1989, Japan had ceased to be an empire, and the emperor was now a ceremonial figure in an increasingly westernized state. Today we are going to learn about the controversial history of Emperor Hirohito, which is at the same time the history of Japan during the 20th century. This is Reynaldo Carrillo speaking. This is the New Encyclopedia, and you can support our channel simply by liking this video, leaving a comment, sharing it with your acquaintances, and supporting us on Patreon, which you can find below in the comments. Hirohito was born on April 29, 1901, the son of then Prince of the Japanese Empire Yoshihito and Princess Sadako, and the grandson of the reigning emperor of Japan named Mutsuhito. Japan is an ancient people that several centuries before Christ records having had its first emperors and monarchs. With a rich and diverse history and development, the ruling class of samurai warriors emerged in the feudal era, with a selfless culture of honor and a vocation for martyrdom that would last until the times of Hirohito, while the Japanese people during this time were centralizing their government. In the 16th century, Japan unified as a nation and would continue its complex evolution until the days of the protagonist of this video. Hirohito was raised under a custom that involves heirs to the throne being torn from their parents' arms to receive an education with special tutors and teachers. All of this with the purpose of purging from the upbringing of future emperors, the vices of palace intrigues, the passions of the royal family, and anything that could psychologically harm the heir. Hirohito very rarely saw his father and could only visit his mother once a week. It was there in the rooms of the Akasaka Palace, with a sepulchral silence and selfless respect for imperial traditions, where Hirohito would learn the first values and qualities of a ruler together with his brothers and other children of the kingdom's courtiers. In 1908, he entered Gakushuin, a secondary education institute for the children of royalty and courtiers. There he would come to know a man of marked influence and whom Hirohito himself would regard as a father, General Nogi Maresuke. Maresuke was an example of the best Japanese on the island. A man known for his loyalty, character, and exalted patriotism, he had fought in favor of the Meiji Restoration of 1868. The Meiji Restoration was a series of events and conflicts in which the dynasty from which Hirohito came had gained power and where the so-called Tokugawa shogunate was established. This was a sort of military feudal regime established since 1603 in which the political and military power fell on the shogun, that is, on the maximum feudal lord or commander of the armed forces, while in the emperor only rested religious attributions. The emperor was an incarnation of divine harmony rather than the leader of the state administration. But this ended with the Meiji Restoration, and Maresuke, Hirohito's mentor, quickly climbed the ranks of the army. With the Meiji Restoration, Japan enters the world stage as a military power with patriotic fervor. The ideal of Japan's destiny was being realized in the Japanese community. A nationalist vision of doing as much as possible to make Japan great and form a vast empire. Maresuke, Hirohito's mentor, was a very nationalist man, attached to this ideal like many other Japanese. Battle-hardened with war scars all over his body, In his later years, he dedicated himself to providing a true education to the children of the courtiers and to the heir Hirohito. Hirohito, with whom he developed a relationship similar to that of a father with his son. Deep down, Maresuke wanted to turn Hirohito into a sort of copy of his grandfather, for whom he had spent his entire life trying to die. On July 30th, 1912, his grandfather Mutsuhito, known as Emperor Meiji, died. Therefore, Hirohito becomes the heir to the throne, that is, the Prince of the Empire of Japan. Similarly, his father Yoshihito, known as Emperor Taisho Tenno, assumes the title of Emperor of Japan. On the other hand, General Maresuke would commit the so-called seppuku, a ritual that follows the ethical code of the samurais, in which upon the death of the emperor to whom the warrior has sworn loyalty, this samurai warrior must also end his life by disembowelment. However, Hirohito's education continues under other tutors at Gakushuin, where he learned geography, science, English, calligraphy, drawing, manual training, and physical education. These are times when Japan is already emerging as a powerful and industrial nation, increasingly on par with some Western countries and aspiring to total control of the Pacific Ocean. 40 years before Hirohito's birth, the figure of the emperor was purely decorative, and Japan was a pastoral country that had remained isolated from the world for almost 2 centuries. But the Japan that Hirohito had seen, now under the hand of Emperor Meiji, had become a vigorous and proud nation, a trading country that exported its raw materials and imported weaponry and technological knowledge from the West to ensure its power, and had also already had conflicts with Russia and China over expansionist issues. Japan now had, without having started the 20th century, important industrial and military possessions in mainland China. The government of Yoshihito, later known as Emperor Taisho Tenno, was deficient in contrast to that of his father. His inactivity contrasted greatly with that of the energetic Emperor Meiji, with whom Japan began its journey towards imperial greatness. Like his son Hirohito, Yoshihito had very poor health, with sequelae that accompanied him all his life, and especially during his mandate. Despite this, Japan maintained a vigorous activity to climb in the concert of nations. There were the government and the armed forces, prominent factions with an imperial culture that defended the ideal of Japan's destiny, also imbued with the ancestral samurai philosophy. Meanwhile, the Japanese nation, taking advantage of the outbreak of World War I, increased its military and economic power over a valiant China, whose Qin dynasty came to an end in 1912, and with numerous revolutionary groups clamoring for a republic to confront the expansion of Europe and Japan within China. During Yoshihito's government, Japan controlled the Chinese regions of Shandong, Manchuria, and Mongolia. By this time, Hirohito finishes his instruction at Gakushuin, and with his father's assumption of the emperorship, he begins to visit him more often than he had done all his life. He is then sent to an institute specially designed for him and his secondary education. In this place, he would come to have several tutors, also filled with Japanese patriotism and assigned to different areas of knowledge: ethics, history, mathematics, science, literature, physics, and fine arts. However, it is not until November 3, 1916, at the age of 15, Hirohito is officially presented to the public as the Prince of the Empire of Japan. The press portrays him as a tall boy compared to the average height of men his age, at 5 feet 4 inches handsome despite his thick glasses, and who had a fondness for tennis, and his favorite book was the fables of the Greek writer Aesop. It would be 10 more years full of learning and new experiences for Hirohito before his father passed away. During this time, different parties emerged in Japan: workers, imperial, feminist, communist, agrarian, and nationalist, within the framework of the so-called Taisho democracy, a period of liberal and democratic trend in Japan. The world was living through revolutionary times, and it held an uncertain future for the heir to the throne. By 1921, Hirohito travels through Europe for 6 months, and his first stop was England, where he was received by a large crowd and by King George V and Alexandra of Denmark. From there, he goes to France, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Vatican City. By the end of 1921, his father's health had deteriorated so much that he no longer had any ability to govern. And that's why Hirohito is named Regent of Japan. The death of Emperor Taisho Tenno, who always tried to stay out of the public eye, would be increasingly imminent. Finally, on December 25, 1926, Yoshihito, posthumously known as Emperor Taisho Tenno, would close his eyes forever. Hirohito is now the Emperor of Japan. Education in the hands of military and war veterans in the first two parts of Hirohito's life would mark in him a sort of fondness for the military institution. That's why in his government the growing influence of the army is reflected, excluded from the Japanese political scene since 1900, and also the displacement of the civil figure of the prime ministers. This, added to the ideal of Japan's destiny, explains a lot about Hirohito's vision and actions. That's why, despite the ravages of the '29 financial crisis and the fact that Japan's military spending accounted for 69% of the government budget, Hirohito decides to undertake the conquest of Manchuria, a region that begins to be disputed by both Russia and Japan since the Russo-Japanese War of 1904, and which resulted in 1931 in the formation of the Empire of Manchuria, an apparent independent state, but which was nothing more than a country that served as a protectorate of Japan. After this, but Ito proposes to go even further, and Japan begins to expand in China beyond Manchuria. This ends up triggering the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937, which did not end until Japan's surrender as a result of the defeat in World War II. Other incidents would occur during the early years of the 1930s in Japan, such as the murder of Prime Minister Inukai, who had proposed to abandon Manchuria and abort Japan's expansion plans, and Hirohito, both in Shanghai and Wuhan in China, during 1932. Also the murder of Major General Tetsuzan Nagata at the hands of young officers adherents to the Kodoja. This was a faction of the Japanese army fervently nationalist and imperialist. This faction sought to purge the heart of the armed forces in 1935. In turn, the very attempt of coup d'etat to Hirohito of the 26th of February of 1936, in which many officials and military were neutralized by that same youthful force. Regardless, the tension of the coming years will not focus on Japan, but there in distant Europe, where the clash of the nationalist movements of the Führer and Benito Mussolini with the United States, France, and Great Britain would come to trigger a conflict of proportions never before seen by man, the period known as World War II. By 1937, Japan saw war as imminent, whether it be a world war or against the United States or some European country, that it launched a series of propagandistic elements that year, among them the Kokutai no Hongi, a treaty with which it sought to exalt obedience to the emperor and the superiority, brilliance, and distinction of the Japanese people. Japanese nationalism saw in its emperor the synthesis of its race, the man called to use the great human resource of the people, known for being warlike and reckless, to lead Japan to the superior destiny to which we have alluded before. Japan, therefore, had a remarkable nationalist vigor, embodied in the emperor and his armed forces, infected by the enlargement of the Empire of Japan, which by 1939 controlled Korea, Manchuria, much of the eastern Chinese coast, Taiwan, and Inner Mongolia, and also aspired to continue conquering territories. The United States and the European powers tried to curb Japanese expansionism in various ways, which clashed with Anglo-Saxon and European expansionism in Asia, which resulted in Japanese disdain for Americans and the British. They couldn't understand how the Europeans could have huge colonies and they, as Japanese, could not. This conflict with the Anglo-Saxon power was one of the main reasons why Japan ended up joining Germany and Italy in the upcoming Second World War. Returning to distant Europe in September of 1939, France and Great Britain declare war on Germany. Thus began the so-called Second World War. Let's remember that the evolution of the emperor's figure since the Meiji Restoration turns him from a quasi-decorative figure to a figure with real powers and attributions that made him a key and active player, especially in the military field. Therefore, contrary to what has sometimes been said, Hirohito played a key role in the chain of actions that Japan would carry out during this historical period. In this sense, on July 27, 1940, in a meeting with the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister, and General Hideki Toyo, the War Minister, Hirohito agrees that the situation in Europe was favorable to intensify Japan's expansionist race, both in French Indochina by military means and in the Dutch East Indies by diplomatic means. At the beginning of the conflict, Japan did not seriously consider an alliance with Germany and Italy because it was seen as more counterproductive than beneficial. However, through the persuasion of his brother Yasuhito and some members of the Navy, Hirohito decides that an alliance with Germany, which had already conquered France and had no enmity with the Soviet Union, could provide greater support in its conflict against the United States and Great Britain for control of Asia. Thus, Germany, Japan, and Italy signed the so-called Tripartite Pact on September 27, 1940, forming the historic military alliance of the Axis powers. In response to Japan's alliance with the European nationalists and the control they already had over part of French Indochina and their sights on the Dutch East Indies and British Malaysia, President Roosevelt orders an embargo on strategic material for the Japanese military industry and extends, like Great Britain, economic aid to the resistance in China, which was at war with Japan. The following year, in July 1941, Roosevelt freezes Japanese assets in the United States and imposes an embargo on Japan's oil supplies, an embargo that was joined by China, Great Britain, and the Dutch West Indies. With this embargo, Japan loses almost 88% of the oil supply it received from these countries, thus jeopardizing its expansionist race. The situation was pressing for Japan, seriously harassed by the Allied forces, although it had not entered into direct conflict with them. For a brief time and at Hirohito's request, it was proposed to try to solve the issue of tensions with the United States diplomatically, but an agreement was not reached in which both parties felt comfortable, and the option of a peaceful resolution was discarded. Japan's fate had already been cast, and all that was missing was some trigger to start the war so desired by the Japanese people, but which filled the armed forces and the emperor with doubts. On September 6 of the same year 41, during the Imperial Conference, Hirohito, not yet wanting to rush a war, sets October 10th as the deadline for the Army's high command to prepare for a war, if the talks with Washington were not at all favorable. Thus comes the deadline that Hirohito had set, and diplomacy had not borne fruit. What followed was already scheduled to initiate military reprisals against the Anglo-Saxons. However, Prime Minister Konoe resigns from his post, expressing his opposition to the international conflict, and Toyo, the War Minister, assumes the vacant position, simultaneously serving as War Minister and Prime Minister of Japan. By the early days of November, Hirohito had already received information about the Pearl Harbor Plan and the first steps of the war, and he decided that all discussions with Washington should be cut off on December 1st. Finally, on December 7th at 7:48 in the morning, the Japanese Navy executes its offensive on the American base of Pearl Harbor located in Hawaii, and simultaneously attacks the English possessions in Malaysia, Singapore, and Hong Kong. It was the formal beginning of Japan in the war, and the trigger for the United States of America to decide to act militarily against the empire in the Pacific. Although the majority of Americans were opposed to the war after the events of Pearl Harbor, the United States government decidedly enters the global conflict and declares war on Japan and simultaneously on Italy and Germany, part of the Tripartite Pact. The same hero had proven that Japan would attack the United States, as he had faith that Germany would win the war in Europe and that Japan could increase its productive capacity to secure a large part of Asia. From 1942 onwards, Hirohito would be a prominent figure, not only for being the emperor, but for being behind the planning and execution of major military decisions. He visited bases, barracks, hangars, ports, and trenches, saw the soldiers, carefully crafted his speeches to encourage the fighters, and visited military schools and industrial complexes to oversee the production of weaponry. The basis of his charisma was his figure as emperor, that mythical aura that surrounded him and made him different from all the Japanese. They saw him as a true leader, imbued with fervent patriotism, where there was no more honored destiny than to give one's life for the empire. Between January and July of 1942, Japan resumes its expansion through Southeast Asia, occupies the Philippines, Burma, Singapore, the islands of Java, and Timor in Indonesia. In addition to Rabaul, Leh, Salamau, and Port Moresby in New Guinea. With many victories and few setbacks, it is said that Hirohito was very enthusiastic about the victories that Japan was achieving, and he wanted to plot a campaign to establish military bases in Guadalcanal, a key island in the Southwest Pacific. However, General MacArthur, appointed by the United States for operations in Asia, lands on the neighboring island of Tulagi with 19,000 American soldiers. The Japanese were stunned because they believed that the American offensive would not start until 1943. The Japanese response to the American presence in the South was vague and deficient. Hirohito decides that the bases near Guadalcanal should remain alert and sends not many troops, as he focuses his attention more on the construction of bases and reserves in the other Japanese possessions. The Japanese bite the dust from August 1942 until February 1943, where they finally abandon their possessions in Guadalcanal and undertake the withdrawal from that strategic site. Hirohito was angry about these defeats, and it could be said that in his recklessness he wanted to solve everything with decisive battles. An almost impossible issue that blamed the incompetence of his subordinates. On the other hand, the effects of the war are gradually being felt in the Japanese economy. In September, Minister Hara says that by 1944 they will not be able to produce the 40,000 planes planned, but barely 18,000. And Minister Nagano could not answer with certainty the question of whether Japan would win the war or not. In the late 1943 and the first half of 1944, Japan is committed to creating the so-called Great Defense Line. Hundreds of thousands of troops are withdrawn from China, Manchuria, and Korea to defend the island from the Pacific. Internal problems are added to the external ones. Internal. The Chief of Staff and Minister Nagano are forced to resign, and then more. Shockingly would be the resignation of General Toyo, the face of the Ministry of War and of Japan's war efforts since the start of World War II. Defeat after defeat at the end of the campaigns in the Marianas, Philippines, and Burma. Between October of 1944 and July of 1945, Japan's fate seemed to be already decided, but Hirohito continued to undertake costly offensives in which the losses of the Japanese army far exceeded the Allied losses. His character ceased to be that of the patient calculator of 1939, and now he was the fiery, aggressive emperor. In May of the same year, 45, Germany and Italy had already officially surrendered. But in Asia, the fight was still as fierce because Hirohito and the Japanese army refused to surrender and fought with all the last resources at their disposal. It is not until August when the Soviet Union breaks the neutrality pact it had with Japan and carries out a lightning invasion in Japanese Manchuria, alongside the unstoppable advance of the American Navy and the fierce bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that Japan finally decides to surrender. These events not only sealed the end of World War II, but also the sunset of the Japanese Empire and the loss of its full sovereignty. Captured and disarmed, Hirohito decides to agree to the surrender of the empire. On the 12th day, he notifies the royal family and 2 days later records the surrender message that was broadcast on all the country's stations. It is said that it was the first time all Japanese people heard the voice of their emperor. Numerous soldiers create a makeshift tomb and take their own lives upon learning of their nation's surrender. Others try to conspire against Hirohito, but these were futile attempts because Japan had to face the procedures of the Allies in view of the surrender. There were not a few Japanese faithful to the samurai and patriotic spirit who considered that the emperor should have fought to the death rather than a dishonorable surrender. On September 2nd, Japan officially signs the surrender, and on the 27th, Hirohito meets with General MacArthur, who gives the green light to his men to act. Parallel to the Nuremberg trials, the Tokyo trials of 1946 take place, developed simultaneously with the military occupation of Japan by the Allies. Hirohito had accepted the terms of the Potsdam Declaration on August 14th, and thus the United States and its allies proceed to militarily intervene in the Japanese nation, with General Douglas MacArthur as supervisor to establish a series of measures with the purpose of initiating the transition from Imperial Japan to the State of Japan only, a sort of parliamentary monarchy influenced and limited by Western powers. So with the occupation of Japan, the Japanese state is reorganized, and educational reform is made to adapt education to a system similar to the American one. The political system is liberalized, a party democracy similar to the Western style is made, an industrial disarmament is imposed on the country, and it is forbidden to have its own armed forces. After the occupation, there were also accusations of excessive meddling and even assaults on innocent Japanese women by Allied soldiers. From the Tokyo trials carried out between 1946 and 1948, the surprising fact stands out that almost the entire Hirohito cabinet that had something to do with the war was executed, and that other officers and personages of lesser participation were first sentenced to life imprisonment, but then released on parole during the 50s. However, Emperor Hirohito was the sole participant not charged for his role in the war. General MacArthur personally intercedes for Hirohito, emphasizing the high importance of the emperor to the Japanese people and knowing the usefulness it would have for the population to accept the new phase that Japan was entering. Hence, Hirohito was granted immunity and was not prosecuted despite his crucial role in the war. The U.S. chose not to divide Japan into two parts like Germany, instead implementing a series of reforms aligned with the interests of the Anglo-Saxon allies. However, Japan's other domains were indeed divided among the allies. North Korea came under Soviet control, South Korea under American control, and China occupied Taiwan. However, the change that most directly affected Hirohito was the constitution that was approved in 1946, in which the nobility was abolished, and the emperor was stripped of all political power and participation in decisions concerning the management of any state structure, becoming a purely ceremonial figure. Thus, from impotence and resignation, Hirohito has to witness the changes of his beloved Japan throughout almost half of the 20th century. The American occupation would cease on April 29, 1952, when the San Francisco Treaty of September 1951 came into effect, with one hand in front and one hand behind, as it is often said. However, Hirohito had to be a witness and not an actor of the transformations that Japan would continue to experience. His job was to be a face of Japan's reconstruction for the international community and to be a public figure present in the Japanese people. In the 1970s, he visits the U.S., a trip that would be crucial for U.S.-Japan reconciliation. He also visits the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Mexico, Paraguay, Argentina, and other countries to show Japan's good disposition in international matters. He would spend long periods at the Kokyo Palace in Tokyo and others traveling throughout the Japanese geography, in retirement homes and on royal vacations with his children and grandchildren. Hirohito was known to have a long-standing interest in marine biology and authored multiple scientific papers on the topic. Finally, at the age of 87, after several health complications, Emperor Hirohito passed away. When Japanese emperors are crowned, they are usually given a certain name that will be a sort of omen during their reign. Hirohito's grandfather was called Meiji, his father Taisho, and he was called Showa, which means bright peace or enlightened peace. Some find this paradoxical due to Japan's role in the war. Others find it appropriate considering the period of peace that has prevailed in Japan from 1945 until Hirohito's death. Either way, Hirohito was the emperor who elevated Japan on its path of imperial aggrandizement, but whose efforts clashed with a huge world conflict that reshaped the international order. After his abdication, with self-sacrifice and perhaps some helplessness, he assumed his role as a strictly ceremonial figure. He was the last emperor who politically ruled in Japan, with a fervent patriotism that has been fading from the hearts of the Japanese after the war, with a firm desire to fulfill Japan's destiny until it was no longer possible for him. This is Reinaldo Carrillo speaking. This is the New Encyclopedia, and thank you all for sharing our videos, for leaving your comments, for following us on our Instagram, and for collaborating with us on Patreon, which you can find below this video. Until next time, and may God bless you.